Hello and welcome. We are now starting our event. We'd like to welcome you and go over a couple of housekeeping rules as we begin. First, we'd like to ask you that if you are speaking, to please unmute and to turn on your video. Next, we would like to say and ask you to please keep time for your interventions. We'd ask each of you to introduce yourselves in the chat. And if you have any comments or questions, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom. Additionally, please raise your hand if you would like to take the floor when we have the open session. With that, I would like to turn over to Elsa to open the event.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody around the world. Welcome to this event. I'm Elsa Stamatopoulou, and I am member of IWGIA's board, and I'm also at the Indigenous Peoples Rights Program at Columbia University. It is this time of year again that we all gather to welcome and learn from the Indigenous World, a unique publication produced by IWGIA every year. It is now the 35th anniversary of the Indigenous World and the 20th anniversary of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And this is a moment for us to take stock of its contribution to the rights of Indigenous peoples. First of all, why is this annual publication unique and special? It is global. It covers the Indigenous world, as the title says. There is no other publication that does that. And it is admirable, frankly, how IWGIA is able to achieve that every year. It is unique because it carries the voice of Indigenous peoples. Can we imagine in the 35 years of its life, how many Indigenous authors, how many Indigenous voices from the ground this publication has covered? The global network of partners that IWGIA has is the most extraordinary strength of this publication. So it is Indigenous peoples themselves from around the globe that are telling their own stories. They who are in the best place to say what is happening to their communities. It is their voices that form the narrative. They weave this narrative year in and year out to build the thread of their own histories. And as we know, it is enormously empowering and transformative for the long term of social justice struggles of people, when people take charge of telling their own stories and histories. So the Indigenous World publication offers this as well. Documentation of Indigenous people situation is important in the world. First of all, the Indigenous World unveils Indigenous people situations and makes them visible, brings out of invisibility these situations. We often speak of unreported struggles because reporting on Indigenous people situations is often missing from mainstream media and reports. So bringing the Indigenous situations out of invisibility matters because it informs and raises awareness of society and of governments. And this is the first step towards positive change. And last but not least, this documentation is a unique source for public officials and policymakers, for NGOs, academics, and all others working on Indigenous peoples' issues. I'm thinking sometimes that if the Indigenous World publication didn't exist, we would need to reinvent it immediately. My warmest congratulations to all the authors who contributed to this year's Indigenous World, and warmest congratulations to the IWGIA team for yet another successful result in the annual marathon to produce this fantastic publication. So I'm now very glad to first of all turn to Catherine Wessendorf, who is IWGIA's Executive Director. She has been working for the organization since the year 2000 in different positions, including as Arctic Program Coordinator, Communications Coordinator, Editor of the Indigenous World, Senior Advisor on Climate Change, and Head of Programs at IWGIA. She represents IWGIA in the Council of the International Land Coalition, and it has an MA in her past in social anthropology from Basel University in Switzerland. Catherine will present to us the book. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elsa, for this very nice introduction to our yearbook, The Indigenous World. I'm also really happy to see that so many have actually already joined us today for this event, and to introduce you to the 35th session or edition of this book. I would like to start my presentation with the recognition of all the people that have contributed to the Indigenous World 2021. This publication is only possible with the commitment of the fantastic authors that contribute with their knowledge, insight, and analysis to our yearbook, some of them actually year after year. I would like to extend our gratitude to all of them, all of you. You are such an important part of our work and our network. And I would also like to thank IWGIA staff who works tireless every year to make this book happen. I know that many of you put in extra hours so that we can be ready once again for the book to be launched at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Great thanks to you. And of course, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our donors that support our work, and particularly the Danish Foreign Ministry, who supports the production of this book. We are grateful for the many years of excellent partnership with you and for the contribution that you provide for us. Now, just to give you a short context of the Indigenous World. The Indigenous World is a reference book. Articles are relatively short and intend to give an overview of the most important events that have happened in the countries during the year. They are envisaged to be used as a basis or as an entry point for other more detailed information on specific topics or country situations. Any omission of a specific country report should not be interpreted as no news is good news. In fact, sometimes it's precisely the precarious human rights situation in a specific country that can make it difficult to obtain a contribution from a country. In other cases, we have simply not been able to get an author to cover a country situation. And finally, I would also like to thank all those who, with their comments and concerns, helped us to improve this publication every year. It is quite a challenge to produce a publication such as the Indigenous World. Elsa just called it a marathon. The time we have for the production of the book is very short, and there is always errata, and we hope for your understanding for this. So, this year's edition of the Indigenous World is, of course, special, as the world has been impacted by COVID-19 throughout 2020. You can already see from the cover of the book that the corona pandemic is a major topic that all articles talk about, no matter if they are about country situations or about international processes. And of course, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues will discuss exactly this topic as well this afternoon, right after our side event, actually. So what do we conclude from the many contributions to this yearbook? The evidence and experiences presented in the Indigenous World are overwhelmingly clear and similar. Indigenous peoples and their rights have been severely impacted by the pandemic. Their needs and challenges were not being taken into consideration in precautionary measures or emergency relief, and in some cases, their rights were further restricted through new laws and measures rooting in the pandemic and being abused to restrict the civic space of Indigenous peoples. However, Indigenous peoples have also shown enormous resilience and innovation in tackling the pandemic. So if we take the negative impacts first, we can read that in many cases, health facilities were inaccessible, health information was not disseminated or made available in Indigenous languages, personal protection equipment was not distributed, relief packages did not consider Indigenous economic markets, and remote education did not factor in the lack of electronic equipment and unavailability of internet access to Indigenous children and students. Further, in most countries, COVID-19 data related to, for example, health and economic impacts was not disaggregated either at all or specifically for Indigenous peoples, meaning it has been nearly impossible to get a clear picture of how the virus affected Indigenous populations in individual countries. In addition to the struggles Indigenous peoples faced due to the virus, they continued to fight discrimination and targeted violence. They experienced a shrinking civic space, lack of recognition of their rights as peoples, and suffer from land dispossession, evictions, and the negative impact of climate change, as well as top-down conservation efforts. And in some cases, as I mentioned before, states are using the pandemic as a way to enact laws that further encroach on their rights. However, despite these many hindrances, Indigenous peoples proactively took matters in their own hands to protect themselves and to support each other. And it's quite amazing to read about all those measures that they took. So Indigenous communities have for generations experienced human rights violations, including violations of their right to health due to viral infections. They have learned how to protect themselves to survive and thus be strong and resilient communities. Indigenous peoples' communities in all regions of the world have already responded to the pandemic using their self-determined protection mechanisms long before national governments took action. Around the globe, Indigenous peoples proactively rose to the challenge to meet a critical need for example, limited access to their communities, for COVID-19 information, as well as precaution measures in Indigenous languages. And furthermore, Indigenous peoples came together to support each other by exchanging goods and sharing information, and by strengthening their livelihood practices. There's ample evidence of the incredible resilience of Indigenous peoples in this book. So as the pandemic has magnified the inequalities of Indigenous peoples that Indigenous peoples have faced for generations, but also really sharpened the focus on the strength and resilience of Indigenous peoples and their communities, how do we build back better? For building back better, Indigenous peoples' solutions need to be heard, as they hold knowledge essential in the design of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, taking advantage of their resilience capacities and knowledge and practices, and with full respect for their rights. Indigenous peoples' full and effective participation in the design and management of health and educational services should also be ensured, and culturally appropriate distance learning opportunities provided. As national governments focus on economic recovery to upend the damage of the global pandemic, many may opt for traditional ways of economic development with a focus on natural resources, large infrastructure projects, and extractive opportunities. Indigenous peoples have long experienced threats to their lands, territories, and resources from extractive industries and large industrial projects. A building back better economy that focuses on these sectors is again likely to have a negative impact on Indigenous peoples and violate their rights and livelihoods. Therefore, Building Back Better initiative need to fully respect Indigenous peoples' rights, and particularly the right to land, territories, and resources, which is essential for their livelihoods and for sustainable and regenerative practices. Indigenous people's own initiatives and businesses must come first and be prioritized. Now, the Indigenous World also includes a number of articles on international mechanisms addressing the rights of Indigenous peoples. As the pandemic spread, many international and regional mechanisms and agencies, such as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, were quick to cancel their meetings and to find ways to continue their important work. In the beginning, adjustments to online and virtual platforms in order to bridge the digital gap between these mechanisms and Indigenous peoples were needed, but virtual meetings soon became an integral and widely used solution. We therefore also want to hereby acknowledge the great effort and adjustments that have been done by international UN mechanisms, particularly those dealing with Indigenous peoples' rights. in order to continue a close and much needed dialogue with Indigenous peoples. One major drawback, however, to the temporary online reality of global meetings has been that while Indigenous peoples did their very best to proactively engage, states and other relevant stakeholders were less active in their participation. Without physical sessions, Indigenous representatives were to a much lesser degree able to directly engage with states and promote their views and demands. Hence, in the Building Back Better, physical meetings will be crucial in order to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to relevant mechanisms and decision makers. As the world embraces the benefit of technology, the voices of Indigenous peoples must not be silenced by transferring crucial processes from in-person, community-driven engagement to online meetings. From IWGIA's side, we are very glad to be able to present the yearbook to you online this time, and to take this opportunity for many to be able to participate in the launch. But we do miss the one-to-one conversations with you about it, and of course we miss you all. After this launch, you will be able to access the book on our website, where it is free for download, including individual chapters. And we from IWGIA hope very much that also this year's edition will be of good use to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for this wonderful introduction. And in very few minutes, you went into the depth of the issues that this new book covers. Really wonderful. I was looking at the editorial, and I really feel that it touches the realities of Indigenous peoples. Now we are very glad to have with us for some opening remarks two persons. And I would like to introduce the first one, Ambassador Martin Villahermann of Denmark. He took up his post as ambassador and permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations on January 1st, 2019. Before taking up his position, Ambassador Villahermann served as State Secretary for Development Policy in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Danida is the brand name for Danish Development Cooperation. Prior to this appointment, Martin Villahermann served as ambassador to Indonesia and was also accredited to East Timor and Papua New Guinea. Therefore, his appointment as ambassador, before his appointment as ambassador, he held several positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as head of Department for Asia and the Pacific Ocean region. And before joining the Danish Foreign Ministry, he worked for UNDP in Bhutan. Ambassador Herman, it is our pleasure to have you here. And we know that you might not be able to stay throughout this panel discussion, but we are glad that you are able to devote this time to our discussion. Thank you very much.
No, Elsa, thank you so much. And no, I would have loved to stay for the entire duration of this, because it's always extremely, not only exciting and interesting, but also extremely informative and very useful. So I'm very, very happy that I have my good colleague, Rebecca, with me here on the call also, and she will stay and listen throughout. Thank you so much for having us again this morning here in New York, Elsa, Catherine, Lola, and David. It's always great to be here. It's always slightly challenging to come after first you, Elsa, and then after Catherine, who have given such a sort of elegant overview of this. But let me just try and say a few words on why this thing, is so useful for us also here in New York. But begin by saying that I'm really, really happy to be with you this morning to on the occasion of this sort of second virtual launch of an edition of this important publication of the Indigenous World. And then to say that for us, I mean, this is an almost indispensable publication that provides us with really, really invaluable information of the almost 500 million Indigenous peoples around the globe. And for us, and I suppose for other like-minded countries and allies to Indigenous peoples, I mean, this publication serves our governments, back home in capitals, but it also serves us here as delegations, but also the wider UN system. And it does so by highlighting, in a very practical sense, key issues on that we need to address if we want to advance indigenous issues. It takes us, if you like, from the conference rooms of the UN into the field, into the realities of real people in real situations, in real context. And I think that is so important. And we know, I mean, Catherine, you talked about it, an awful lot of work goes into this publication. And I want to pay tribute also to all of you who have contributed to this. I want to tell you that it's not for nothing. It's not just for your consumption. It is actually really, really important work, and it helps us do our work. And I want to thank you for that. Now, when we met a year ago to launch the 2020 publication, we were in the early stages of the pandemic. And I suppose, although we didn't at that time have the full picture on you in its entirety, the extent of the challenges ahead of us and the consequences it would have, I suppose we were already seeing how the pandemic was hitting the most vulnerable and the most marginalized the hardest. And I think here a year later, it's very clear to us now that the pandemic has had grave impacts on the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples on all fronts, and thus to some extent presenting new threats, not only to their sustainable living, but actually to their very survival. And I think the focus of this year's publication on indigenous peoples and the pandemic, I think, is extremely timely, and it's welcome. And I think in the publication this year, it's documented how indigenous peoples have not only been disproportionately impacted by the effects of COVID-19 and its consequences, but also actually even more worrying, I suppose, how the crisis has been used to legitimize initiatives that targets and restricts indigenous peoples' freedoms further. This is not something that's exclusive to indigenous people. We've seen this with civil society across the board, where I suppose at a time of crisis, in the midst of a pandemic, we ought to, if not physically, then at least socially, come closer together. But we've actually seen a widening gap between those that govern and those that are governed. And I think this is a key challenge that we need to address. Now, here at the UN Denmark, also as part of the group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples in New York, we have during the pandemic sort of put out calls for the protection of the health, the well-being and livelihoods of indigenous peoples in response and recovery efforts. Because as we look, as we mobilize trillions of dollars to recover from the pandemic, crucially important that we get these things done in the right way. But as we have seen, in many cases, indigenous peoples have not been, consulted, have not been engaged, not even taken into account during the response efforts. I suppose if there is one conclusion, then it is that COVID-19 pandemic has actually brought to light what we already knew. It has laid bare things that we already knew, and that's the structural inequalities and marginalization that indigenous people suffer under. And I think as we look towards what you might call sort of the other side of the pandemic, the post-pandemic world, we must look towards not only a more sustainable, but also a more just future, to build back better and greener, but also to build back more just now, in a more inclusive manner. And to do that, we must take into consideration indigenous peoples and lead, if you like, an inclusive recovery. And this is not a nice to, no? This is a need to. If anything, the pandemic has been nature's warning shot to humanity. So this is a need to, both for people and planet. And I think, the Indigenous World in this year's edition will, play its contribution to this. Is an important piece of reference material for us that works here at the UN, reminding us of realities out there in the real world. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and especially what the word you said, that socially we have to come closer together in these circumstances, and these words, build back more just, resonate in me, and I feel that this report is doing that. I mean, even its various chapters that it has identified it really make the point, and I'm very glad that although there has been the report of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on this topic, there is even more that is coming out now through this report of IWGIA. So thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you, as we say, in the Zoom corridors of the Permanent Forum. Thank you. Now I would like to turn to Chairperson Ann Nuoram. Ann Nuoram is a Finnish Sami leader and politician, member of the Sami Parliament of Finland since 2000, and she's the current chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She has also chaired the Sami Council. She holds a Master of Laws degree and is currently a public law researcher at the University of Lapland, particularly of Sami law. Ann Nuoram has been working on reconciliation issues and now works as the head of the Sami Council's Human Rights Unit. It is my great pleasure to give her the floor, and I also understand that as chair of the forum, she might not be able to have the time to stay with us throughout, but we are glad for whatever time she has to give us in this discussion. Please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elsa, and good morning, everybody. Indigenous brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be with you at the virtual launch of this Indigenous World 2021. The Indigenous World is a unique publication to understand Indigenous peoples' situations, advancement and challenges globally. It gives comprehensive overview of the situation of Indigenous peoples at national and regional level. Moreover, the book also gives a valuable insight of international processes and initiatives affecting Indigenous peoples. And it is a result of collaborative effort between Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists and scholars who voluntarily document and report on the situation of Indigenous peoples worldwide. It is easily accessible by anyone, and it's widely used to understand the Indigenous peoples' conditions in different parts of the world. As speakers already mentioned, the year 2020 was certainly a diverse year. It was a year full of challenges for Indigenous peoples at national, regional, and international level. At national level, the coronavirus pandemic affected Indigenous peoples in various ways. In many countries, Indigenous communities already experienced poor access to healthcare, significantly higher rates of diseases, lack of access to essential services and sanitation. Moreover, Indigenous peoples' lifestyles have often a collective dimension as traditional livelihoods. Gatherings and ceremonies are often practiced community-wide. Due to the lockdowns, some Indigenous peoples faced food insecurity as a result of the loss of their traditional lands and territories. Simultaneously, Indigenous peoples continued to be persecuted, threatened, criminalized, and killed in their efforts to defend their rights, sometimes under the excuse of emergency laws for the pandemic, as in the same cases, these laws and regulations also allowed for Indigenous people's rights to be violated and their lands to be exploited. At the regional level, the coronavirus pandemic affected Indigenous peoples in an unprecedented way. Indigenous peoples that live across more than one country, as the Sami people, we are not able to meet each other cross borders. Due to pandemic, border traffic at the external borders of the states were restricted. These restrictions on crossing the border have had a significant impact on Indigenous peoples. Regional cooperation between Indigenous peoples living in the same sociocultural area was also hampered due to the traveling restrictions. At the international level, most of the international processes were postponed or cancelled, like the meeting of the Permanent Forum. Some of the international meetings were held online, but considering the unique and current circumstances of Indigenous peoples, virtual meetings are not the best solution for Indigenous peoples. Yet, Indigenous peoples were seeking their own solutions to the pandemic. They were taking action and using traditional knowledge and practices such as voluntary isolation and sealing of their territories. Indigenous peoples have been helping each other for providing food and organize themselves for virtual caucuses during the global processes that were held online. Some Indigenous people started to draft their own pandemic preparedness plans as the Sami people. The purpose of the Sami plan is to guide pandemic preparedness at all levels of governance to ensure the realization of the Indigenous rights of the Sami people and the continuity of the activities of Sami society during a pandemic, and the right of the Sami to maintain and develop cross-border relations. Building back better after COVID-19 through national, regional, and global cooperation must include Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and the right to live as Indigenous people, also in exceptional situations, in a national, cross-border, and global perspective. The right to self-determination and the right to participate in decision-making in matters concerning Indigenous peoples should be not impaired in an exceptional circumstances or thereafter. Indigenous peoples hold knowledge, resilience, capacities, and practices essential in the design of the response to COVID-19. Indigenous peoples and their specific circumstances need to be taken into account when planning and drafting strategies on preparedness and recovery. And I'd like to congratulate IWGIA and all the authors of the yearbook. And I'd like to thank personally and of the importance what the book has been in my work as an Indigenous activist. I'd like to share a personal memory from year 1997 when I first participated at the working group on Indigenous population in Geneva. And my elders, those who were educating me on Indigenous rights, they told me that most important side event at this meeting is the launch of the yearbook. You should definitely go there and get one book and study that when you go back home. And that has been my advice also years afterwards to the newcomers. And personally, I really like to thank of all the work you are doing. And to conclude, I hope this 35th volume covering 62 countries and 20 international processes and initiatives will be widely read and studied to enhance knowledge of our unique situations worldwide. Heat.
Thank you so much, Anna, and for all your points and for sharing this memory. I will share one of mine similar that I remember myself running to catch up to Lola on First Avenue and saying, I can't come because when I was at the Secretariat of the Forum, I can't come to the event, but will you keep a copy for me, please, begging. You know? So it is that kind of book. And now that I am a teacher at the university, it is always part of my curriculum. It's impossible not to have it in the syllabus, you know. So yeah, we are sharing this with the world. Thank you so much. I would now like to turn to the part of our event which is called Voices from the Ground, and to introduce our three speakers today, Ruka Sambolingi, Haman Buba, and Alfredo Viteri Gualinga. And first of all, I will introduce all of them together. So Ruka Sambolingi is the first female Secretary General of the world's largest indigenous organization, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, Aman, Indonesia. Ruka is There is a Torajan woman from Sulawesi Island with a long history in the indigenous rights movement. And now Hawe Haman Buba is an expert in human rights and humanitarian law. She's a member of the working group on indigenous populations / communities of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. She's a member of the Cameroon National Commission for Human Rights and Freedoms and president of the African Indigenous Women Organization Central African Network. And Alfredo Viteri Gualinga belongs to the Quechua people of the Sarayaku community, Pastaza province, Ecuadorian Amazon. So our three panelists have been, will be addressing what has been the greatest impact of the COVID pandemic on their communities in Cameroon, Indonesia, Amazon region of Ecuador. Second, how indigenous peoples' resilience has been manifested. And third, what means building back better for the future of indigenous peoples. So without further ado, I would first like to give the floor to Ruka Sabolingi. Ruka, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Will I be able to share my screen? Okay. I have some just pointers that I put on my screen here because I wanted to share some of the situations last year from Indonesia. At the policy level, we call it rollback in the time of pandemic, in the time of difficult situations where with regards to the policy concerning indigenous peoples and also the human rights situations of indigenous peoples in Indonesia. So we actually started to recognize COVID only in the March in 2020 last year. I actually early March, I still attended a wedding ceremony of my nephew at home. So when I came back to my workstation in Jakarta, and that's where we realized the situation is getting worse and we are not going to go anywhere. So ever since we've been working from home. Then Aman, we started to enforce our lockdown, indigenous lockdown on the territories since March last year. Although the government is still denying the virus, the existence and the threat of the virus, we already knew that we need to protect ourselves because first we are in the location where we don't have good access to health care system, and also this is also the result of history of discriminations of indigenous peoples. So that's why we knew things are going to get worse and we need to protect ourselves, otherwise no one will take care of us. So that's why we started our imposing our lockdown, our indigenous lockdown very early, even earlier than the government. So what is when we say about rollback, that's really when things are getting worse when it comes to the policy and human rights situations of indigenous peoples. What is happening is then during the pandemic, when the situation is getting worse, the national parliament using that chance to adopt many of the laws that are so unfriendly, that are so dangerous for indigenous peoples. And these laws are on including the revisions of the law on coal and mining, on mineral, and also especially what is very famous now is what they call omnibus law on job creations. But these two laws are we're adopting without our participations at all, because how we were going to participate? We couldn't, because we were hiding from the virus, and all of our indigenous communities, the members of AMAN, have been on lockdown, so there is no way we can participate. And even if we want to protest, we were so scared to get out of our community, because even if we want to go on the street and march against the law, when we go home, what will happen to us if we catch the virus when we were in the cities? Because city has become the most dangerous, unsafe place under the sky. So that's why that's why these things is happening now in the Indonesia last year. There's a continued neglect and criminalizations of indigenous peoples also during this COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia. And because we couldn't go out and demand for our indigenous rights to be protected and to be recognized legally, then the bill of indigenous peoples remains a bill until now, until today. And then again, it continues that the legal recognitions of indigenous peoples, it's very, we call it sectoral, or based on sectoral laws, which is very complicated and full of condition that actually will not allow us to get there. We have to spend like years and years and years to get recognized legally. And then also during that time, there is no effort from government to stop the how you call it, exploitations of our indigenous territories. In fact, the existing land grabbings or the existing grabbing of our indigenous territories, the conflicts, they were escalating because during this pandemic. We are thankful because there is no actually new cases, but the old cases that pre-existed before the virus, they don't stop. They even use the situations of pandemic when we were all on lockdown to even continue to encroach our territories. So the land grabbings, and then also, of course, criminalizations of human rights and fundamental freedoms of indigenous peoples escalating. At least in last year, we recorded in Aman, we recorded more than 40 cases of indigenous people's human rights violations. And these are all about affecting at nearly 40,000 people, nearly 20,000 families, and impacting more than 31 hectares of indigenous territory. And these are all the number of the cases that involve indigenous people. So we have cases from plantations, mining, dam and power plants, as we speak now about the sustainable energy in the hand of our government. They turn it into dam and power plants in indigenous territories. So this is one of the most challenging time when it comes to energy now in Indonesia. We do have, of course, with the government projects on forest, we still have continued conflict with plantations for pulp and paper and pollutions. We do also have facing problem with the military institutions on the street. And these are some of the examples of how indigenous peoples are being affected. So if you see the pictures on the left, top on the left, and the beautiful dress of our president during the anniversary of Indonesia, commemorations of Indonesian anniversary, the same dress that was used by our dear president were actually coming from the land of the people that were affected at the same time when president is using their dress. So this is the contrast of what is happening in Indonesia. And also on the left, the main picture is the Effendi Buhing, who was dragged out of his home and were about to be brought to the city to be custody by the police office, by the police at the police stations, but they managed to escape. So that's what the situations during that. But when we speak about the resilience of indigenous peoples, because I think pandemic is all about resilience and strength of indigenous peoples, we do have tried to respond the COVID at different level, yeah. At the organizational level, we are, because in Aman, we do have already policy on emergency response. So that's why we immediately, as Secretary General, I push the emergency button, and then the system is already in place, will take into effect. So all our friends will already establish the task force across Indonesia. So it's not only in headquarters in Jakarta, but also in our 21 regional chapters and 120 local chapters and in indigenous communities. So we have that task force, and we are lucky because we do have also emergency fund available. So that's how we can help ourselves and also help our community to gear up to face the crisis. And of course, as everybody knows, that we are working on virtual. We're using Zoom so much and also WhatsApp call, but this is very good because in the end, our activities is even increases. So we are getting more busy because of this pandemic. When people are hiding, we are getting busier and busier. And especially we can reach out more to indigenous communities and knowing the situation because of the connectivity during this pandemic. So this is one of the good to impact, and also to show how indigenous organizations and indigenous peoples, it's important to have the preparedness mechanism in the organizations. At indigenous communities level, when we talk about resilience, I think the COVID-19 is, we call it our friend, really, because at that time, this is the time, all the things that we have been fighting for, all the things that we have been struggling for, we all get the answers. It shows that as long as we are, because we are on lockdown, and we, at first, of course, we conducted rituals because that's our force as well. And all the indigenous individuals who are coming back from the city, we perform our own, we call it our indigenous quarantine. So some of the people who coming back from the city are put in the shelter that they built by community, but some also are doing quarantine in the farm, in the forest even. So that's what we call indigenous quarantine, but they are all taken care by community collectively. So there's no like individual quarantine. Everything who came back from the city is taken care well by the community. So that's the situations. And then of course because especially for our task force members, they do have to protect themselves because they are taking care and coordinating the work at the community level. We do need our self-protected, so we are also producing masks, we are also distributing masks, and even we are getting help from our friends to get some personal protection equipment, even for the healthcare of the government, the healthcare centers in indigenous territories, because we consider them as part of our indigenous peoples, because they are in our territory, and because they also then don't have enough equipments from the government. That's why we need to go out and try to get help for them as well, because they are also our frontliner. And then food is apparently very important during the crisis. So we managed to get all of our community to actually identify and check how much food do they have, if they have enough food or not. If they don't have enough food, then we will have to help them, sending them food. but if they have more food, then they can keep it, and then they can also help others around them. So this is, as Elsa mentioned earlier, and also Catherine also mentioned earlier, it's very true. That is what's happening during this hard time, that we help each other. And then, of course, indigenous medicines is becoming more and more popular now. People are still using, of course, the chemicals, but also we try to use, especially on indigenous territories, then our elders, they say the most important thing is our immune system. That's why they are producing what they call immune boosters. I don't know how the herbal medicines and all these things are produced and distributed throughout the community. So this is the situations of a indigenous food based on our lockdown, and also the work of our task force. We managed to get the three stage of indigenous food in Indonesia. One is the treated one, especially for indigenous peoples we have considered nearly extinct. They have lost their land, especially to corporations, and they are also facing discrimination, stigma, and all these things. So we call them near extinct, because they literally near extinct. And then we do have what we call critical. Critical is the one who have become labor for plantations, for example, or those live in near urban areas. They become like informal sectors employees. And oil palm farmers, they don't have enough food, and in the areas where there is a drought. So this is all the climate disasters, or from floodings, or indigenous peoples whose indigenous food has been replaced by the rice, because they become very much depending on the market. So if you don't have money to buy from the market, and then you are starving. So these are the two groups that we have been deploying food to them, and also get the nearby indigenous community to help them with food. And what we call secured. Secured is, that's true, indigenous people who still manage and have full control over our land. These are the group that we call it secure group, where they do have, at least we were actually undermined in Aman. We undermined the pandemic, because we call it, we thought it was going to be just maximum 6 months, but apparently more. So we were like, at first we say, okay, make sure you have enough food for 3 months, and they say, yeah, we do have 3 months, and we are going to have a harvest in 3 months, so we will have enough. And some indigenous peoples are actually having like food enough for years. So this is what we call a secured, where we don't have to worry about them. And as long as they are disciplined on lockdown, they will be totally fine. So when we talk about building back is really that is the way forward. And I think the COVID telling us that the global economy, the global market structure is collapsing. So that's why we really need to build the global market from local to the global. We need to build a strong, sustainable indigenous economy. At least we need to reclaim our own local markets nearby in our province, in our districts. That's actually where the real economy that we need to reclaim back. And food sovereignty is so important. I think I don't have to explain further on this, because this is what it is during this pandemic. And again, collective actions. We've been preaching about collective actions, and during this pandemic, it's true. We got the answer from pandemic that collective action is the one that will keep us alive. And yeah, solidarity. So how do we take care of each other? We do take care of each other. We do take care of between farmers, between labor unions who've been living in the city. They don't have food because they've been abandoned by the company that they have been working for years. So we, indigenous and farmers, are the ones who take care of them. We bring them food to the city, like tons of rice. At least we have brought, at least here in the capital of Indonesia, tons, 100 of tons of food, rice, have been brought to the city to help the labor unions, the member of labor unions. So it is not the company to help them. It is not the government who help them, but it is us, indigenous and farmers, who help our sisters and brothers who are being neglected in the cities. And then I think, again, I don't want to, this is very, very clear, yeah, also from the pandemic, during this COVID pandemic, the role of indigenous women and youth and the young people. We do have the movement of homecoming movement of our indigenous in the last 10 years, and they were the one who've been keeping the community safe. Those are the ones who returned from the city and decided to go home and take care of our homeland. They were the ones who survived, who make, and not me who live in the city. I'm constantly, even now when I go out, I need to take care of myself, doing my mask and everything. They who have gone back to our territories, they are the survivors. So I think now when we talk about build back, we need to talk about the rural areas. We need to talk about the indigenous communities, our contributions that we have been saying out loud over the years needs to be heard. And when we talk about development, we need to take care of our Mother Earth, because we only have one Mother Earth. And I think with that, by taking care of our Mother Earth, we are keeping the humanity safe. I think that's from me. This is the examples of our young people who have gone home. So we have hundreds of indigenous communities working now. We have leaders who are working on the field. And I think with that, I will stop from here and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruka. This was such a rich presentation. Taking notes, and I was struck by your phrase at the beginning, COVID, we call our friend, COVID-19, because it brings out to the surface all the issues, as you said, and this also very encouraging and inspiring actually movement of going back, the homecoming movement. I have heard it also in other countries, and it's really great. It's one of the practices. So that's great. Thank you so much. I would like to ask, as we go forward, our participants, our audience, to please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can try to answer some before the end of our panel. So I would now like to turn to Haman Buba and hear from her about Cameroon. Hawa, this is your turn. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elsa. And it is my pleasure to join this team today during the launching of the Indigenous World 2020. It has always been my honor to be part of this work, this valuable work, as a contributor or an author for Cameroon for almost a decade today. I would say that Indigenous World is a very, very valuable document. And I can say that I'm so used to or addicted to contribute or to be part of the thing. I'm already so used to it that I start preparing the article early year when there is any event concerning Indigenous issues. I start already looking for information, gathering the information, and by the end of the year, when they call for the articles, I got already much information and I just start writing. So I think this book is very, very important. I will talk a little bit about this book before. And it is a book that it is a tool for visibility for Indigenous people. This book contains a lot of themes, different issues: human rights, land, resources, climate change, resilience, adaptation of Indigenous people. So this book is, I can say that it has helped scholars, it has helped Indigenous experts, just like Elsa yourself, you said. It has helped even the government officials, especially in Africa, where the Indigenous concept is very, very controversial, where we have many states, not wanting to discuss this issue on Indigenous people. So it is very important that we always, when I receive these books, most of the time UGIA sends me cartons of the books and other publications, and I always share to different government departments. I also take some to university libraries. And I noticed in 2019, when I visited my university, I went to the library and I was looking for the Indigenous World and other publications that I left in the library, and I did not find even one of the books, which means that the students have taken the books away because of the importance of the book. So I just want to say that we use the book. I myself, I've used it for my research, and when we have any staff, the Indigenous World, because that's where they can get all the information, all the mechanisms on Indigenous issues, and they can read and understand before they can, start working for the organization. So I think that this book is so important. It's very, very valuable for us. I will want to go now straight to the topic which I'm supposed to talk about, COVID-19 and its impact on Indigenous people in Cameroon, and maybe other countries also in Central Africa and West Africa, where we did a little research. So in Cameroon, the first case was declared in March 2020. And today we have about 39,000 cases of COVID-19 in Cameroon, about 800 deaths, with about 37,000 recoveries. And this year we have a surge in the pandemic since December, and it is a very deadly pandemic. This year is very, very virulent hospital for COVID. And in fact, it's very, very difficult to visit that place, because every day you go, you will be seeing corpses that are being taken out from this hospital. This, we just say yesterday alone, we have registered so many deaths, and important personalities, let's say so, are really going, and it is frightful. It's very frightful. So COVID-19 and Indigenous people in these countries, in Chad, Nigeria, those are the three countries where we did a little bit of research. The information on COVID-19 pandemic is found mostly on television networks. It is found on international television network. It is found also on the national television network. That's where this information is being passed regularly. And we know that Indigenous people live in inaccessible zones where you don't have television. They also do not understand the language that is being used, to talk about this very complex issue of COVID pandemic, which is it's a complex issue. What will an Indigenous person really understand? about this complexity, which is explained in languages that they don't even understand. So we can say that indigenous people were left out of the program on COVID-19. We saw the state trying to do what they can do. It is something very new. It took them unaware, and it was difficult even to mobilize for the cities. Then we cannot even be thinking that they will be worrying about those who are very inaccessible. I think they will imagine that those people are spared from the virus. So they were struggling to put up structures because there were no structures in the cities, which were the epicenters of the pandemic. So it took them time to even put up those. In fact, it was such a confusion that everybody was struggling just to save his or her life. If you can have some medication, people get it from the media. You say you can take this drug and get well. So many people, if you go to the hospital, sometimes you are rejected. You are asked to go back home and wait, and then you go back. And so many people were struggling to take whatever they could take. Or if you have a patient in your house, then many people would be infected because the hospitals did not have the facilities to take care of COVID-19 patients. So, but later during the year 2020, at least the state struggled to put up some structures where they could take the COVID patients. There were no tests also at the beginning. We had tests just later in the year, and most of the tests were not they were not very, very, there were tests that were not very good. Sometimes they are positive when it is negative. Sometimes they are negative when it is positive. So those tests were sent to Cameroon by China, by a businessman from China. But this year, later the year, at least the country was able to have more and more, they did more and more testing, and today it is generalized in the cities, only in the cities. So where indigenous people live, you cannot test for COVID-19. It is difficult to test for COVID-19. So indigenous people were left out completely. They were left out. The indigenous organizations tried to do what they could do to help their own people. So they did what they could do, some small fundings from left and right, and they could sensitize. They sensitized communities, not all the communities. They could not sensitize all the communities. So they sensitized where they could sensitize, distributed some sanitation kits to some communities. But we were also happy because the communities, we never registered any COVID-19 cases, but indigenous people who live in cities, many were infected last year, and even this year, many are being infected. But for now, we haven't registered in the communities. It may be if they have been, we will not be able to know, but we had information from organizations that were working for these indigenous people. We had information from one organization that works for pastoralist people, which is an organization that has its headquarters in Burkina Faso, but it has also an office in Cameroon, and they receive fundings from, I don't know what is the organization, I think it is the International Organization for Migration. So they worked on the borders between Chad and Cameroon, and they were sensitizing pastoralists who were moving in between Cameroon and Chad and trying to talk to them about the COVID. So I was told that the pastoralists knew about the pandemic. They had an idea because they visit markets all the time to buy their basic necessities. So they were aware that there is a disease which they cannot really explain, but they have an idea. And they distributed some sanitation kits, and then told them how they could prevent this disease. And they also told the organization that they witnessed a very severe flu from October last year to this year, very, very severe flu. And they don't know if it is COVID or it is not COVID, but they said some of them went to the hospitals, few of them went to the hospital, because these are people who are nomadic, who are moving from Chad into Cameroon and Cameroon into Chad, or they are on transhuman corridors moving for transhuman purposes. So they said they experienced very, very severe flu from October last year to this year. And they also said they use their herbal knowledge, their medicinal knowledge. They combine 3 types of plants and they used, and that is what helped them and to get well. So it is not, we cannot say whether it was COVID or it was not COVID, but that is what came out from them. And then we had also another organization, Boskuda, they sensitized also in the Northwest region. They had fundings from Village UK, and they also gave out materials, sanitation materials, also educated them on how to prevent explain what the COVID is all about, how it contaminates and how they can prevent. Said is that using the preventive measure, it is because they have the community life, they have collective life, they eat together in the same dish, they drink from the same cups, they still have their ceremonies. And it is difficult to say that they shouldn't have the ceremonies. So that is a challenge, a very big challenge. With all the organizations, with all the communities where we work, we notice that they still live the life they used to live, their community life. There can be many in a place and there is no distancing. They will eat together in the same dish. They will drink from the same cup. So there is it is really very, very delicate in case we have this pandemic, you know, if somebody visits them or somebody with the pandemic comes to this locality. So that is the difficulty that we have. But we have, at least many indigenous people have been sensitized, be them the hunter-gatherers. We have sensitized the African Indigenous Women Organization, the organization of the hunter-gatherers. We have sensitized in the eastern region of Cameroon, where we have the Baka people. We have another organization, Bakuda, has sensitized in the south region of Cameroon, where you have the Bageli people. It's true, it is difficult for this organization to reach out to all indigenous people, but we have done what we can do. Talking of resilience measures, I think that, as I said, implementing the measures is very difficult, the protocols for indigenous people. But indigenous people, at least we saw that they had their resilience. They had their resilience in the fact that the zones where they live is inaccessible. At least we know that the epicenters are cities and people going and coming from the cities. That inaccessibility already is an advantage to the indigenous communities. And we also noticed that they stepped up their indigenous knowledge using their medicinal plants. And we also noticed that even people from out of their communities were going down to the communities to get medicinal plants, because in Africa, it was proven that the medicinal plants could treat COVID. We saw it in Madagascar and also in Cameroon. The Archbishop of Douala city has produced very big quantities of herbal medication, which from his own, from what he says, has cured so many people, maybe thousands of people, I don't know exactly. But I think that he even received support from the government to produce more of that herbals. So many people were leaving the cities to go to the indigenous communities to get their knowledge, to get the herbs that they could use to help to prevent this disease. So most of them, they combine many herbs, maybe roots, barks of trees, different trees and leaves, and those are what they used. So I will say that we did some recommendations when we did that the small study. We thought that if we can support indigenous people capacity, indigenous people's organization, we strengthen their capacity so that they can continue on how to manage, first of all, the crisis in general, and the COVID crisis in particular, because we have seen that it is only the indigenous people that reach out to the indigenous people. The government is not there. So I think that supporting the indigenous people's organization is very important. Then we also said the indigenous organization should continue to intensify sensitization, information, and education of the IPs wherever they can, using any channels possible. They should continue doing it, because right now it is really will be very, very important that these communities, because if it happens with their way of life, it is going to be really, really a disaster. So it's good that we continue to sensitize, to educate them and give them the information about COVID. Then we also think that we can also support indigenous people to regenerate. It's been abandoned. It's been abandoned as it is not passed on. It's not passed on to future generation, because the future generation, they don't find any advantage in it. So most of them are moving. They have moved out of their communities to the cities. So it is important also that we should regenerate the indigenous knowledge so that it can help indigenous people and even many other people. So we also think that the indigenous organizations, if they have the support, they can, give indigenous, distribute health kits to indigenous communities, like the like soaps, like adapted buckets, churches around places of God. So this is what we gathered. And this study was done for Nigeria and also for Chad, and the story was the same. And I think during the African regional meeting of the Permanent Forum, many other people contributed from East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa, and they said the same. They said the problem was communication, the problem was the language, the problem was that indigenous people do not have programs. There are no programs that cover for indigenous people. So indigenous people are really left out to themselves during this crisis period. Thank you very much. I think I conclude my intervention here.
Thank you so much, Howe, for really giving us a very comprehensive image of what is happening and the resilience and the many ways in which you have, as you described, Baskuda and others have been dealing with that. And it's really very good to learn, and also the importance of traditional knowledge. Now, last but not least, Alfredo Viteri Gualinga will share his thoughts with us. Alfredo.
Buenos días, gracias.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I think there is a translation in English, right? First of all, I want to thank IWGIA for this invitation, and I want to congratulate them for the launching of this publication. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation that we experience in the Amazonian region. We have been affected by COVID. First of all, I would like to mention the following. This pandemic of COVID-19 has visibilized the absence of the government when dealing with crisis. When dealing with environmental problems, health-related problems, problems related to human rights. So the government is very present on indigenous territories when it is about extracting resources like wood, like oil, like minerals. And this has become really, really obvious. And this is very concerning for indigenous peoples. Here in the communities, we have experienced very negative effects, and it is mostly related to the health situation, health from elders, from women.
Que los adultos en sí.
These segments from the population are more vulnerable than others. The pandemic has affected most of the communities in the Amazonian region. It has affected our health, as I already explained. But there are other specific impacts. For example, education. Schools were closed. They are now half closed, half open. In our regions, remote training is very challenging. Families in indigenous communities also suffer the economic effects. Why? Well, the communities cannot sell their produce anymore. They cannot go to markets. They cannot travel to the cities. A lot of communication and a lot of roads have been closed. This obviously has an impact on the economy of families, and this also impacts their health and the needs of their children, etc. Now, one concern regarding all these impacts is the announcement from the authorities. The authorities issued an announcement, and the announcement is the following. They wanted to double production. What does that mean? Well, this would mean that Ecuador would intensify the granting of extractive permits, especially regarding oil extraction on the territories of indigenous peoples. This is where these resources are located, and this is very concerning. The pandemic and the impacts from the pandemic are worsening the social, economic, cultural impacts that are already affecting indigenous peoples. They have been happening for almost 50 years. There are activities related to extractive means, and this has very serious consequences. So I want to highlight once again, the government has not been present when dealing with this problem. Here, there are indigenous people who have been infected by COVID and have not been registered in the official records from the authorities. They are not part of those statistics. This is a very big problem. The authorities do not care, and they don't know about, and I am talking both at local and regional levels. They just don't care. However, indigenous peoples have succeeded in dealing with this challenge. They have taken many measures as a precaution. Right now, we actually face new restrictions. These restrictions started a few days ago. They refer to movement of people and cancellation of meetings and etc. So communities again cannot sell their produce. So we are now facing a new wave of the pandemic. And it is affecting indigenous territories and the Amazonian region. But as I was already saying, indigenous peoples have succeeded in dealing with this, and this is thanks to our efforts. One excellent measure from indigenous peoples has been the protection of our forests. Protecting our forest has allowed us to have the necessary resources to face the pandemic. Another very crucial aspect has been the mobilization of men and women who are knowledgeable about ancestral means and traditions. This has played a key role. Another essential aspect has been solidarity. We've witnessed solidarity among communities, among indigenous peoples, based on the cause that unites us all. So we have witnessed very strong cases of solidarity. We have been sharing medicines, we have been sharing traditional plants and roots, and this has enabled the youth to learn about it, and it has helped us fight the consequences of the pandemic. We have also been able to share food. We have actually shared the produce from our own gardens, from our own fields with others. These are solidarity practices among the IU people, and this has enabled us to fight off these huge impacts on health, on nutrition, on economy. could also reactivate the mingas, these community meetings. And again, the application, the implementation of the ancestral knowledge of men and women has been critical. This knowledge has been applied in each of their communities. And this has been used to provide food to families, do the follow-up, etc. So we can say for certain that forests are the ones that have ensured our continuity. They have helped us with our food. They have helped us remain hydrated. They provide us with water, with nutrients. So we can see how important it is to preserve our forests as a source of life. Now, indigenous peoples have many years of experience. And now we need to look more in depth at the relationships that we have with the government. From now on, we need to establish a two-way commitment. We need to establish relationships where the government commits itself to the future of indigenous peoples, to their well-being. This pandemic has brought about a whole perspective of colonialism. It has brought about certain policies. And now, here, for indigenous peoples, the government just does not care about us. The government does not include us in their programs, in their measures dealing with the pandemic, in their replies.
De los grandes detentores del poder político, económico. Eso ha sido muy claro.
This has been very obvious. I can confirm that as of today, no indigenous person has received the vaccine. In big urban areas, politicians are being vaccinated, also their friends, also entrepreneurs, people in the private industry, but indigenous peoples are completely out of this picture. Indigenous peoples are not being counted. They are left out completely. So we need to rethink the relationship that we have with the authorities, with the government. There are many initiatives about how this relationship should look like. We should reflect upon our own strengths, our own efforts, everything we've been doing over the years. So we think that it is very important to strengthen the control and also self-determination abilities on our territories. We think it is essential to work on this re-evaluation. We need to rethink also the right to self-determination, etc. The interpreter apologizes. There are some sound-related issues. We need to preserve the knowledge and the traditions and the ancestral information that we have already in our communities. This ancestral knowledge has guaranteed us, has ensured that we have in the past, has ensured that we continue on that. So once again, we need to reflect on this resettlement on territories. Many areas have become more urbanized throughout the years. There are some indigenous communities that opted for a big resettlement. And in these areas, the effects of the pandemic have been even worse. And these are the areas that have faced bigger challenges. There are also more remote areas. And there are areas with settlements close to riverbanks and close to forests with access to plants and medicinal resources. Those areas are the ones that have succeeded better at fighting the pandemic. So we can say we need to replan, we need to reconstruct those communities and those settlements. We need to go back and rescue those ancestral ways. We need to go back and see how we used to manage, for example, water resources or land areas, etc. So we need to build back communities with buen vivir, communities that can enjoy life.
Consideramos que es fundamental y levantar como una bandera.
We think that this is essential, and we need to ask the government in Ecuador to revise all the policies regarding the extractive sector. We think that all the operations that are active should be stopped, and all the grants that are given to the private industry should stop as well. All extractive operations are a door to diseases. This is a door open to depletion of resources, to affecting the nature, but not only nature, the health itself of indigenous peoples. So what we are doing is to redesign our own life plans. We want to draw a different way, and we are basing it on an indigenous worldview. This is a worldview that respects the balance with nature, etc. So these are some of the considerations that we have. And now we need to get to work.
Eso implica para nosotros
The interpreter apologizes. There are sound issues. Thank you. This is everything. This is all from me. Thank you so much.
Alfredo, we heard your intervention. It was sometimes interrupted, but we heard. Thank you so much, Alfredo, because you brought out something that is so obvious around the world these days. How can the state, in this gravest of circumstances that the COVID pandemic presents, actually show this absence that you talked about, and in fact showing presence in terms of encouraging extractivism that actually harms further indigenous peoples. So, and you also stressed the huge importance of strengthening back the structures, the governance structures of indigenous peoples. Dear friends, it is impossible to do justice to this amazing, all these rich reflections, and we are out of time now, unfortunately. So as you saw in the chat, IWGIA has shared their email, so you can please share your questions to IWGIA, and IWGIA will respond to you. So I want to thank at this point all our panelists and all the participants and IWGIA itself. And just to say that the inspiration that we are getting out of this is that we are in this together, and that solidarity must be the underlying principle of all of us as humanity in this most dire of circumstances at this moment. So with these words, and enriched with the many extraordinary insights that each and every of the speakers presented, I would like to close this meeting, to thank you for being here, and let us continue and meet each other again in the Zoom corridors of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. Best regards to everybody. Bye.